Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Let's do a quick video. Hopefully it's a quick video. I guess we'll see. Looking at the way that your kidneys are responsible for maintaining fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and acid-base balance. So your kidneys don't just filter. They do all these other things too. And so when we're talking about this, we're going to be talking about water. Now, water makes up most of the fluid in your body. Outside of your cells, it's 99% of the fluid. This is known as the extracellular fluid. Now, we're going to be referring to it as the ECF for the remainder of this video, but you just need to make sure you can keep that in mind. It's also an essential ingredient of the cytosol in the cells. The cytosol, remember, is the liquid part of the cytoplasm inside of your cells. This is also known as the intracellular fluid. ICF is how we're going to refer to it from here on out. And all of the operations that happen within the cell at the cellular level rely on water. If water is not there, these molecules and things cannot come in contact with each other to react. And so the volume of your ECF, the solute concentration, and the pH are all very important. And so these two things are stabilized by three different processes: fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and acid-base or pH balance. Starting with the fluid balance, this is the daily balance between water coming in and water going out, which involves regulating content and distribution between ECF and ICF. Basically, where is the water? The digestive system is the primary source of water coming in, and the urinary system is the primary route that we lose water. So basically, we balance these two systems and their regular everyday functions. We've got electrolyte balance, and this is gain or loss of electrolytes. And again, intake is going to be governed by absorption through the digestive system, and loss is going to be mediated by urine production in the kidneys. Finally, we have acid-base balance, also known as pH, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And this is gain or loss of hydrogen ions. When you're talking about acids, if you think back to chemistry, or maybe don't, the active ingredient in acids is that hydrogen ion. Typically, your body is going to naturally generate acids. Think lactic acid during regular metabolic activities and stuff like that. And so your kidneys are going to get rid of those hydrogen ions through urine. And it's also responsible for creating buffers, which sort of absorb some of the hydrogen ions and absorb some of those effects. Your lungs are also responsible for getting rid of a lot of this stuff. And basically what ends up happening is you eliminate carbon dioxide, which also helps limit hydrogen ions because those get bound up in water. And I'll do a little bit of chemistry talk about that later. So now what we want to do is we want to talk about something called fluid compartments. All right, so when we're talking about body composition, there's basically two parts. Well, there's two parts. You've got the solid parts and you've got the liquid parts. Most of your water is located actually within your cells. So most of you is water. In males, 60%, in females, 50%. Most of that is located in the intracellular fluid inside of your cells. The other stuff, the extracellular fluid, ECF, is the interstitial fluid. That's the fluid in between the cells, and the plasma, along with other body fluids. Now, the other body fluids include things like lymph, which is the stuff inside of your lymphatic system, cerebral spinal fluid, synovial fluid, the sort of liquid lubrication in between your joints, serous fluids in the various cavities of the thorax, so pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal, your heart, lungs, and visceral organs. Aqueous humor, which is the stuff inside of your eyeball. Paralymph and endolymph also count in there. This is a breakdown of ions that are found in the ECF and the ICF. Now, they're called fluid compartments, as remember I mentioned that's what we're talking about, because even though we can have material exchanged between the two fluids, they don't freely mix. They are treated as separate entities. And they end up also with differing ion compositions. If you look here, the extracellular fluid is primarily sodium, chloride, and carbonate. And in the ICF, it's primarily potassium, magnesium, and phosphate. And a lot of those are going to a lot of those differences are going to drive a lot of the regulatory processes to maintain those balances. Now, osmotically, so water-wise, the concentrations are identical. And so typically when you have ion exchange, because water freely flows across that membrane, ion exchange doesn't. So it happens across selectively permeable membranes, that plasma membrane. And that's basically what sets up these different compartments, the ICF inside of the cell, inside of that membrane, and the ECF outside of that membrane. So like here's our cell, we've got stuff inside, that's the ICF, and we've got stuff outside, that's the ECF, and that membrane keeps them separated. Now you can have ions exchange between those two, but that happens across the membrane through channel proteins and stuff like that. It also can happen through the endothelial lining of capillaries, allowing blood plasma, which is part of the ECF, to go into the interstitial fluids and then into the cells themselves. It can also happen through the lymphatic vessels draining into the venous system. Solute content of the ECF varies regionally and by types of amounts. Depending on where it is, the interstitial fluids around your small intestines are going to be different than what's around your kidneys or your lungs, for example. We've got varying amounts of electrolytes, proteins, wastes, and nutrients. Regulation of the fluids happens through monitoring the ECF, not the ICF. We don't have any receptors that directly monitor the ICF, and we're also not directly monitoring fluid or electrolyte balances. We are responding to changes, so increases and decreases, but not ever static levels. Your body only responds if the level changes, basically. The water cannot move by active transport, and that's important because active transport allows a level of control of exchanges. You can't do that with water. Water is going to move through the membrane based on concentration gradients that we talked about. Remember way back in the day, like Unit 3, when we talked about cells and stuff like that. So if you take in electrolytes like sodium, for example, that's going to drive movement in water. If you lose sodium, that's going to drive movement of water the other direction. So hormones are released to trigger either the release of sodium or the retention of sodium, which is going to drive water balances. There's 3 of them. There's ADH, aldosterone, and natriuretic peptides. Real quick, ADH we've talked about a bunch. It stimulates the kidneys to stop producing urine. That's going to concentrate the urine and lead to less water loss. It's going to promote fluid intake by stimulating the thirst center. You're going to get thirsty and start drinking water. Osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are going to monitor these changes, releasing ADH into the pituitary gland, and be driven by higher osmotic concentrations. So basically as you get thirstier, your fluid levels start to drop. You release more ADH to accelerate this process. Aldosterone is another one. It's secreted by the cerebral cortex. Now, this one is important to note that it responds to changes in sodium and potassium levels. That's not good. Let's try that one. And that's going to stimulate the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. If you need to go back and review that, there's a picture in my note slides that you can look at for the second video, and there's also, we covered in greater detail when we did the endocrine system at the end of last semester. So go back and look for those notes too. This is going to regulate sodium absorption and potassium loss by the kidneys, which is going to cause the kidneys to conserve sodium with a high plasma concentration. It's also going to stimulate water retention because you have more sodium in the ECF. Basically, this kind of gets us to the water follows salt sort of idea. The last one is the natriuretic peptides. This is going to sort of stop this process. Now, there's two peptides, ANP and BNP. Those are going to be released by the heart, basically, in response to stretching of the heart walls. And this is going to be triggered when the blood volume increases. This is going to reduce thirst. So you've been taking in water. Blood volume is going to stretch those heart walls, release these peptide hormones. That's going to reduce thirst. That's going to block ADH and aldosterone from being released, which is going to tell the kidneys to start producing urine, lower blood pressure, and lower plasma volume until you kind of get back to where you're supposed to. That's it. Okay, so fluid balance. Remember, we've got mechanisms for fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base. So that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, so fluid balance. So fluid balance is when water gained balances water lost, right? So you're taking in water at the same rate as you are getting rid of it. Body water content and sodium concentration are inversely correlated. So as one goes down, as body water decreases, sodium concentration is going to increase and vice versa, basically is what that means. So we have this diagram right here looking at gains and losses. Now remember, everything that is going on is going to be monitored by what's happening in the ECF right here. However, we can assume that if it's happening in the ECF, it's also happening in the ICF. As far as water movement is concerned, okay, overall solutes that are in there may be different, but overall solute concentration is going to be similar. And so water is going to move to match, all right? So just keep that in mind. Water gains coming in, we gain about 2,500 milliliters of water per day. Now that comes from, like right here, that comes from drinking water. That comes from water in our food. And that also comes from metabolic generation. You actually make water. When you're going through cellular respiration, basically, we're taking those glucoses and that oxygen, and we're making the water and the carbon dioxide. And so we're producing that water. There's our 2,500 milliliters. Losses come from, well, there we go. Losses end up being about the same, 2,500 milliliters per day. Now, your mileage individually may vary, okay? These are just averages that we're doing. So, water that we lose some in your feces. We lose a lot of it in urine. Most of it is in urine. We can also lose it through water vapor lost at the skin and the lungs and secreted by sweat glands. That is sensible perspiration. That's the sweat glands. Insensible perspiration is losing water evaporatively, sort of leaches out of the skin, or you breathe it out. Sweating can cause significant water loss. If you notice, it says variable. So you're outside on hot days, you're sweating a lot, you're liable to lose more water than you normally would. So that's why it's really important when you're outside and it's really hot or you're doing a lot of exercise, you drink more water because you're losing more water through your sweat and stuff like that. Something else to sort of keep in mind in all this one is fever, which is an internal raising of temperature, can lead to increased water loss also. So that's why it's really important when you're sick, even though it sucks and you're like, why would anybody do anything to me except let me roll over and die? You really need to drink fluids because your rate of water loss is increased. And so you need to match that so you can maintain your fluid balance. That, if you don't, that leads to dehydration, which we get into in just a little bit. Water can move in between ECF and ICF osmotically. There aren't any large-scale mechanisms or circulation or anything like that, so it happens at the cellular level. You don't have major circulation systems like you do, like your circulatory system, right? That's moving water in between ECF and ICF is going to happen at that cellular level. Within the ECF, water circulates freely. You have different pressures, kind of similar to what was going on with the kidney video that we watched, that last one. You have hydrostatic pressure, which is pushing water out of the plasma into the interstitial fluid. You have net colloid pressure that is drawing water back into the plasma, which ends up giving us a continuous filtration of fluid. We have fluid going in like this, and we've got fluid coming out like this. So there's no net movement, is what we would say. Imbalances, disorders of this include edema, which is swelling. So you have too much water moving from the plasma into the interstitial fluids. Lymphedema is when this happens because of blockages by the lymphatic ducts. And so that blocks water from leaving the interstitial fluids, going into the lymphatic ducts, into the venous system, so that the fluid in the interstitial spaces just builds up. So talking about fluid shifts, that's what these diagrams are going to give us a little bit of information about. So osmotic gradient is going to determine water movement between ECF and ICF. If the osmotic concentration of the ECF decreases, that means the ECF is going to become hypertonic to the ICF, and water is going to leave the ECF and it's going to go into the cells. So that's what we have in this situation down here. The opposite happens if the osmotic concentration decreases, then the ECF is hypotonic to the ICF. That's going to decrease the ECF volume, and that's going to drive more liquid into the cells, basically. And this is very much going into what we saw with the egg lab way back at the beginning of the school year, and that water moving in and stuff like that. As we lose water and we lose fluid volume in the ECF, that's going to cause water to leave the ICF, bringing that volume back up, diminishing the volume of the ICF, and then they end up being equal again. As you increase that ECF volume, that's going to drive water back into the ICF, and then they're going to be balanced once again. Dehydration is a severe form of water depletion where water losses are greater than water gains. Typically, if you lose water but you keep electrolytes, so for example, it's just sitting, you're losing water without necessarily losing electrolytes. That's going to cause the osmotic concentration in the ECF to rise. So there's more electrolytes in the ECF than there are in the ICF. That's going to drive water out of the cells into the interstitial fluids. stabilizing that balance, bringing it back into equilibrium. However, since the volume of ECF is so large and it sort of acts like a reserve, basically a water reserve, the net overall change in how much water is in the ICF in your cells is really small because there's so much water there. Severe water loss, however, can happen from excess perspiration, inadequate water consumption, especially in the long term, repeated vomiting, and excessive diarrhea. Those can lead to significant health problems, and they can lead to them very, very quickly. Homeostatic responses to severe water loss include the ADH and the renin secretion, and behavioral changes, which is the fluid intake. Distribution of gains, if water is gained but electrolytes is not, your ECF volume increases, which makes it hypotonic to the ICF. That's going to draw water from the ECF into your cells, into the ICF. This is going to lead to hyperhydration or water excess. You drink too much water too fast, and your body doesn't have a chance to basically shed the excess water. The cells will become disordered. Solute concentration around enzymes are going to decrease, which is going to decrease their effectiveness and disrupt overall normal cell functions. It can lead to seizures as well and stuff like that if you're disrupting ion concentrations and stuff like that. Hyperhydration, if you do that, you drink water too fast. You inject a hypotonic solution into the bloodstream. That's why IVs are never pure water. You're not able to eliminate excess water. Renal failure, heart failure, liver failure, or liver disease will inhibit your body's ability to generate urine, as well as endocrine disorders that lead to an excessive ADH production. Signs of hyperhydration include hyponatremia, which is low sodium concentrations that can affect central nervous system, water intoxication. They seem kind of sluggish. They can't. They lose motor coordination and stuff like that. All right, so that was fluid balance. Maybe a good time to take a break if you need to kind of review some stuff. Come back to me. We'll talk about electrolyte balance.